Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, a judge said he could stay. The Trump administration deported him anyway.
The allegations and evidence that the Trump administration has here is incredibly unsubstantiated and incredibly flimsy.
Kilmar Abrego Garcia is one of many deported from the U.S. based on allegations of gang ties. And with the government ignoring court orders, including those of the Supreme Court, what recourse do they have? I'm Natasha Del Toro, and this is The Take. So let's start with the person at the center of this case and what we know about him. Kilmar Abrego Garcia left El Salvador in 2011 when he was 16 years old. That's because, according to court documents, he faced death threats from a gang that tried to recruit him and had extorted money from his mother. So he moved to Maryland as an undocumented immigrant and built a life working construction. In 2019, he was at a Home Depot along with some other men looking for day labor work, and they were arrested for loitering, and he was put into immigrant detention, where he was asked about gang affiliation. He denied it repeatedly, and we're going to come back to that point a little later in this episode. But at that time, a judge granted him protection from deportation because of credible gang threats he had faced back home. He's now 29 years old, is married to a U.S. citizen, has 3 kids, and has no criminal record in the U.S. or El Salvador. Despite all that, last month, he was picked up by ICE agents and told his protected status had changed. He was then deported and thrown into a notorious prison in El Salvador. My guest today has been following this story closely, and she's going to explain how this all happened.
I'm Nayna Gupta. I'm based here in Washington, D.C., and I'm the policy director at the American Immigration Council.
Wonderful. Let's talk about Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Let's just start with how did this happen? I mean, how is it that despite a court order, a standing court order, granting him legal protection to be here, he was deported anyway?
So Mr. Abrego Garcia was one of several hundred men swept up in Trump administration actions to rapidly disappear a group of people on a plane to this El Salvador mega prison.
Many were sent to El Salvador without trial or criminal charges of any kind to this prison where they have zero contact with the outside world, including lawyers and family.
The Trump administration intentionally sidestepped basic due process that is required under the Constitution and immigration law. They intentionally deprived these men of a fair day in court when they undertook these actions. And Mr. Abrego Garcia, in his instance, the Trump administration absolutely violated an immigration court order that prevented his removal explicitly to his home country of El Salvador. And they were able to do that because this is an administration that is openly flouting the requirements both under immigration law and our Constitution. And they themselves admitted on the record that this was an administrative error.
Right. And the Supreme Court has ordered that the U.S. government facilitate his return to the U.S., but the government has refused to do that. I mean, how are they justifying just ignoring this court order?
Right. And to be clear, right, this is the Trump administration or ignoring multiple court orders. It's ignoring an immigration judge's order. It's ignoring a federal district court order and now the Supreme Court's order. And they have primarily advanced 2 arguments. The first was that there's an impossibility, supposedly, of bringing him back.
We can't extradite citizens of foreign countries to our country over the objection of those countries. Obviously, to do that would be a monstrous violation of international law.
And I think most Americans understand that that is just a blatant lie. These set of disappearances, whether under the Alien Enemies Act or this error with Mr. Abrego Garcia, all of these were subject to a diplomatic agreement where the president called President Bukele of El Salvador to make an agreement to send these men to a foreign prison. In that same vein, the president could pick up the phone and tell President Bukele to return Mr. Abrego Garcia. And I will add, by the way, that the Department of Homeland Security has erroneously deported thousands of people in the past. And when they admit that there is an error, they have a process to bring people back. The second argument that the Trump administration is offering here is that they have the authority under national security and foreign policy powers to do whatever they want. And the reality here, Natasha, is yes, there is wide latitude and discretion that the president and executive branch have when it comes to matters of national security and foreign policy. But that power is not limitless. And that is why, even with an extremely conservative Supreme Court, all 9 Supreme Court justices made clear that before anybody is removed to a notorious foreign mega prison, there must be basic due process. And so this argument that the Trump administration is making is an absolute overreach of the power given to the president.
And now they're saying the Trump administration is denying that this was an administrative error. On Fox News, Stephen Miller blamed the Justice Department lawyer who said it was an administrative error. And apparently this lawyer has been fired.
A DOJ lawyer who has since been relieved of duty, a saboteur, a Democrat, put into a filing incorrectly that this was a mistaken removal. It was not.
That's correct. So the administration officials who spoke accurately on the federal record to underscore the administrative error at hand in Mr. Abrego Garcia's case were retaliated against by the White House and by the top administration officials. And then we saw these same administration officials go to great lengths to defend this decision and suddenly changing their tune on what happened here.
And the administration is continuing to repeat that he's a member of MS-13, which is a gang that was started in LA in the 1980s that has roots to El Salvador.
The simple reality is that the police said he was an MS-13 gang member. One immigration judge said he was an MS-13 gang member. ICE said he was an MS-13 gang member.
And this is an accusation that he's been facing since that time he was picked up in 2019, which he has consistently denied. And he's never been charged with a crime, I might add. Can you tell me, what evidence does the Trump administration have, continuing to claim that he's a member of MS-13?
Right. So it's important for listeners to remember that immigration proceedings are civil proceedings. So evidence in immigration proceedings are not tested in a formal criminal court of law. Now, the allegations and evidence that the Trump administration has here is incredibly unsubstantiated and incredibly flimsy. We're talking about a 2-page police report written by a police officer who, by the way, was soon after dismissed for his own criminality for sharing confidential information with a sex worker. That police officer, in a 2-page report, claimed that Mr. Abrego Garcia's apparel, which constituted of a Chicago Bulls sweatshirt, was indicative of Hispanic gang activity. That is code language. That is racist. It is racial pretext for accusing somebody of being in a gang. And the police officer said that a confidential informant who is not named also pointed toward Mr. Abrego Garcia's membership. This is the only evidence that they have offered. In a criminal court of law, this would absolutely never stand. It is hearsay evidence. And because this evidence is so unreliable, it wasn't at issue in his immigration case at all. It was the first Trump administration that released Mr. Abrego Garcia into his community at the end of his case so that he could obtain lawful work authorization because they knew he posed absolutely no public safety risk. And that correlates and corresponds to what Mr. Abrego Garcia has consistently stated, which is he is not a member of this gang. And in fact, the entire reason he left El Salvador is because he was afraid of gang violence being directed toward him.
So this was already settled in 2019, right? This case has gotten a lot of attention because Abrego Garcia was deported, despite the fact that there was a court order preventing his removal, granting his legal protection here. But this is not the first time that the Trump administration has deported people based on flimsy gang affiliation claims. If we remember going back to Trump's first term, I was actually reporting this story in Long Island, New York. They were conducting raids. They were detaining immigrant teens, often without presenting any evidence or holding hearings.
I have a simple message today for every gang member and criminal alien that are threatening so violently our people. We will find you, we will arrest you, we will jail you, and we will deport you.
So, Nayna, maybe you could put this into context for us. Trump was declaring a war on MS-13 back then, and detaining immigrant teens, many of them unaccompanied minors. Do you see a playbook here?
Yeah. So, look, the Department of Homeland Security does have a history of using flimsy and sham gang allegations to target middle to younger age men from Latin American countries for detention and deportation. Now, one of the reasons it's been too easy for the agency to bring these kinds of allegations is because although there is due process in the immigration system, you don't have a right to an appointed lawyer in the immigration system. People facing detention and deportation in the immigration system do not have the right to confront their accuser the way that we do in a criminal legal system. These lesser protections makes it easier to bring flimsy or weak evidence against somebody. And the department has used evidence of tattoos as reason to accuse men of being in gangs, even
clothing,
just like in Mr. Abrego Garcia's case. They used notoriously flawed gang databases as a basis for making these accusations. And the Trump administration leaned in on that vulnerability and problem in the immigration system. And in its first administration, there was even a lawsuit filed by the ACLU on behalf of young men who'd been falsely accused. And in that case, the federal judge ordered, dozens of those cases to be entirely dropped. That's how weak the evidence was. And so what we saw with these removals to the El Salvador mega prison based on allegations of gang membership is really the Trump administration taking this final extreme step in what has been a history now of devolving due process in the immigration system when it comes to these kinds of allegations.
So the point is the tactic of deporting people based on these sort of alleged gang ties with very little evidence isn't new. And so what we saw in the first Trump term, sometimes it feels like he was just starting to hammer out the plan to see what they could get away with.
I think that's exactly right. It was an easy place for the Trump administration to start testing the boundaries of the rule of law. Mm-hmm. We went into this election with the American public more supportive of a restrictionist immigration agenda. The combination of that sentiment and the lower levels of due process in the immigration system made it a ripe area for the Trump administration to lean into in this moment.
More with Nayna after the break. So let's talk a little bit about Abrego Garcia and where he is now. So Nayna, he's been sent to this prison. It's called CCOT, the Terrorism Confinement Center, which was built under Salvador President Nayib Bukele, who was in Washington on Monday. The Trump administration has kind of deferred to him at this point, saying that Abrego Garcia is a Salvadoran citizen, so that it's going to be up to President Bukele whether he's returned or not.
Can President Bukele weigh in on this? Do you plan to return him?
Well, I'm supposed to not suggesting that I smuggle terrorists into the United States, right? How can I return him to the United States? Like, I smuggle him into the United States, or what do I do? Of course, I'm not going to do it.
What is Abrego Garcia facing in this prison in El Salvador?
The C-Corp prison in El Salvador has a notorious history and a, documented track record of extensive human rights abuses. People who enter that prison usually do not come out alive. It is maximum security prison where torture and abuse is regular and part of the daily living in that facility. We know if Mr. Abrego Garcia, is still alive and is still in that facility, that he is facing enormous risk to his life and his security. That is why his partner has been all over the news, making pleas and cries for his return with urgency.
And I stand before you filled with spirit that refuses to bring down. I will not stop fighting until I see my husband alive. He is a father, a son, a brother, and a proud member of CASA and SMART Union member who has dedicated himself to make our family's American dream reality.
He fled El Salvador specifically because he felt risk to his life. Now he has been sent back there, and in particular to a place where there will be a target on him.
Oh, yeah, that's a terrible irony and tragedy in this case, that he has been sent back exactly to the worst place, probably the most dangerous place for his life. Now, Bukele's made a deal with the U.S. to hold deported migrants in these prisons. What is in it for Bukele? I mean, why did he agree to do this?
Look, so just first to say, President Trump cozying up to President Bukele in this deal is a first warning signal to Americans. President Bukele himself has a track record of violating the rule of law and due process in his own country. He has incarcerated tens of thousands of people in a supposed crackdown on criminal activity without any semblance of a fair day in court. This is in many ways the Trump administration using Bukele's playbook. Now, the deal that was struck, what we know is that the United States government paid $6 million to President Bukele and the Salvadoran government to do this. But there are many experts who have come out since and said there is likely to be a lot more to this deal. What we know is that the United States agreed to release a certain set of Salvadoran men to President Bukele in exchange for their government holding people in the C-Corp prison. There have been assertions made by experts that this could have included men who would have testified against President Bukele in ongoing court proceedings here in the United States in a way that would have been damaging to him. There have also been reports on the ways in which, behind closed doors, President Bukele has actually been negotiating with criminal organizations. And this is information that President Bukele would not want out in order to maintain his authoritarian-like control in his country. So, right now, these are just assertions. We don't have this evidence before a court of law, but that is, alarming to those of us watching.
And it's also worth mentioning the financial benefit and political benefit, frankly, that Bukele is getting from all this. I mean, it bolsters his tough on crime image that has worked very well for him and has made him popular. And also, this could give him maybe potential relief from tariffs from the Trump administration.
The Trump administration is good at bullying and threatening and using tariffs as a negotiating tool and way to coerce governments into acting a certain way. And absolutely, there are incentives for President Bukele to get in bed with the Trump administration in this manner. And, these are both now leaders who are relying on fear-mongering rhetoric. They are preying upon fears of public safety and crime. And I will say, I think the Trump administration has overreached. President Bukele is the leader of a country that has faced enormous levels of violence and disorder as a result of criminal organizations. The United States, on the other hand, has a decreasing level of crime in this moment. At the end of the day, over 9 out of 10 non-citizens here in the United States do not have a criminal record. And so while the Trump administration can continue to use this fear-mongering rhetoric, I do not believe that it will take them as far as it has for President Bukele, because this is a different context, and the public understands what it means to get a fair day in court.
Thank you so much for making that point. I think that's so important to say. Violent crime in this country has been going down, so I appreciate that. In the 3 months that Trump has been in office, lawyers say that his administration has violated court orders at least 6 times. If this administration can repeatedly ignore court orders, how can migrants who are facing deportations and their advocates push back? I mean, how do you hold this administration accountable?
Yeah, so look, when you have a president defying orders of the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary, we are in a crisis moment, and it can feel very difficult to hold leaders like this accountable. And so this is a test for Americans. The Supreme Court and the federal courts will have to step up. We've already seen a district court judge find probable cause of holding the Trump administration in contempt for violating these orders, but the courts can't do it alone. And we have seen that when Americans speak out to say, this is absolutely unnecessary for safety, in fact, it's using safety as pretext to violate court principles, that is successful. That can work, but that does require every one of us to speak out, because the consequences of not doing so when we have, over 3.5 years ahead of us of this administration could be extremely dire. And Mr. Abrego Garcia's story and experience has been galvanizing.
Well, Nayna, as depressing as that is, we'll leave it right there for today. Thank you so much for coming on The Take and explaining to us just how we are really facing a constitutional crisis here.
Thanks so much, Natasha, for having me.
And that's The Take. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to give it a like so more people can find this episode. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know what stood out to you, or if there's anything that you'd like us to dive deeper into next time. I'm always checking in, so let's keep the conversation going.